Without further ado, I would like to open our first session titled The Environment, Climate and Global Warming, and the Anthropocene. It's a pleasure to welcome our speakers today. We're joined by artists Carolina Caycedo, TJ Demos, writer, and Patricia and Rowland, Rebele Endowed Chair in Art History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and artist Hrair, Sarkissian. This session will be moderated by Amy Niang, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Africa Institute, Sharjah. Unfortunately, John Akomfrah will not be able to join us today. He apologizes for missing this panel, but you can catch his film African Soldier at the Alhambra studio on Tuesday. Each panelist will present first, followed by a discussion and audience Q&A, and I would now like to hand over to our panelists.
Buenos dias, good morning. Large hydroelectric dams are structures that are more than 30 feet high or that impound more than 200 square kilometers of water. There are more than 40,000 large dams in the world. They impound 60% of the planet's major river basins. The water behind them blots out a terrain bigger than California. Their turbines generate a fifth of the world's electricity supply, and the water they store makes possible as much as the sixth of the Earth's agro-industry. Dams are the largest single anthropogenic source of methane, being responsible for at least 23% of all methane emissions due to human activities. They also release carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and they're accountable for at least 4% of the total warming impact of human activities. Geophysicists believe that the weight of dam construction is such that it has tilted the Earth's axis and changed the velocity of its rotation. And also altered the shape of its gravitational field. And nearly 80 million people have been displaced by dams around the world. In tandem with ideas of progress, clean energy, green power, sustainable development, nation-states and transnational corporations have monopolized the imaginary and the visual references around dams. They have become symbols and landmarks of progress and development, inherently essential for the supply of electricity and water for industrial, mining, and agricultural advancement, and for urban consolidation. Dams are embedded in the nervous system of the modern nation and of nations that traffic with the illusion of modernity like mine, Colombia. My intention is to turn this imagining around and ascribe new meanings to these symbols by considering the wall of the dam and the subsequent reservoir of water, or of toxic mine tailings in the case of mine tailing dams, as visual and theoretical references to expose machineries of physical, legal, and psychological containment, and how these processes of containment lead to a corporate filtered existence and a homogenization experience of the everyday. Dams are an important layer of the construction of physical and psychological landscapes. The technological accomplishment involved in the engineering and building of a dam functions as a taming process of the so-called wild and remote nature. But it's also an ideological tool that regulates our relationships to bodies of water and to the land. Dams alter and mold how we understand and relate to nature today. The Three Gorges in China, the Itaipu Dam between Brazil and Paraguay, the first and second largest dams in the world, are not solely hydraulic works of development structures. They also function as ideological sites. They are landscapes of Western development enclaved in non-Western territories. The containment of the river as a transformed territory, the containment of the inhabitants of the area for the sake of new flow of capital, the water containment, the energetic flow for the global trade resources, make evident that in these processes of contentions and flows, there is a reorganization of visuality, and it's a process of disciplining the gaze. Since the decade of the 80s, the construction of dams worldwide, and I mean hydroelectric and mine tailing dams, have increasingly been surrounded by social unrest and environmental conflict. In the last decades, dams are equal to social and environmental trauma, as well as displacement and dispossession, land grabbing, through legal structures such as eminent domain. Unlike dams and infrastructural works in the past decades, this new territory does not materialize as a social space, where there was this issues around tourism and dam building, but rather as a landscape for profit and sometimes for terror. Some dam projects have even been approved as clean development mechanisms so that they can generate carbon offsets for the market. Across the Americas, some dams have been strategically constructed where mass graves from armed conflict can be covered by the reservoir. Other dams drown sacred grounds or important archaeological sites. We call dam terrorism to the uncertainty of living beside a mine-tailing dam that can collapse any moment due to the effects of climate change, as it continually happens in Minas Gerais in Brazil. I believe these oppressive symbols and their fake rhetoric of sustainability and progress can be turned around. The conceptualization and production of new imaginaries and visual references can challenge the imposition of development and extractivist policies and their subsequent social and environmental degradation. There is a need to undiscipline our gaze as part of a larger cultural shift, with space and time to think collectively about sustenance, and I insist on the word sustenance and not sustainability, because by definition, sustainability means to keep the rate of production, and we cannot keep this rate of production. So space and time to think collectively about sustenance, political ecology, and to alternatives to development, or what Arturo Escobar calls post-development. By rethinking the symbolics of hydroelectric and mine-tailing dams, we insert ourselves in collaborative initiatives that intersect social justice and environmental practices with contemporary art making, a totally valid and necessary move in the consecution of new worlds. While dam builders consider a river as a site of extraction of water or of energy, or consider a site as a sacrifice zone to build structures that hold toxic and deadly matter, for natives or for local communities, the river enables social relationships. It is also the sacred golden thread where ancestors, futures, and past dwell, and where spirits dwell. The river is the bearer of fish, a living being with a fluid body and a soul. In many locations, especially in Abya Yala or Latin America, rivers are legal subjects of rights. In the European summer of 2013, I had the good fortune to interview Mamo Pedro Juan, the spiritual leader of the Cogis of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a mountain range which runs along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. The Cogis and other indigenous groups who live there call their territory the heart of the world, el corazón del mundo. And it was seriously wounded by the building of El Cercado multipurpose dam on the Rancheria River, which began construction in 2006 and is still not finished. Mamo didn't speak Spanish, and his interpreter, Santos, the younger guy in the picture, helped me with the interview. I got out my video camera, adjusted the focus, the aperture, the shutter speed, the microphone, and when everything was ready, I began to record. My first question was, what does El Cercado Dam represent for the people of the Sierra Nevada? The Mamo answered, the dam is like a knot in the veins. No, it's even worse. The dam is like a knot in your anus. The dam is like a knot in your anus. When the Mamo began to speak, a yellow circle appeared on his face, and it throbbed intensively while he spoke. A halo of light had slipped through the diaphragm of the lens to light up the head and the words of this indigenous elder. And I realized that it was not only the Mamo who spoke to me, but also el corazón del mundo, the heart of the world. And so this phrase, part of making me squeeze my butt every time I think about it, that the dam is like a knot in the anus, also made me think about infrastructure at a human scale. We always think about infrastructure as something that's monumental outside of us, but actually there's a lot of infrastructure within us, within our bodies too. And And I started thinking about, some of the effects that extractivism has over the body, the human body. I started really realizing that when an extractivist project comes into our territories, it does not only extract the so-called resources that I prefer to call common goods, such as energy, water, minerals, oil, you call it, but ultimately it does extract knowledge out of our bodies. And I started looking, and by spending time with communities, that these everyday gestures that are repeated over and over again, these choreographic gestures that are sophisticated over time, that are a product of accumulated knowledge, that knowledge that we inherit from our grandmothers and our mothers, such as weaving the net, such as washing gold, such as casting a net, or paddling, or carving our own paddles and paddling down the river, and that are intrinsic to these geographies, that we call these gestures geochoreographies, these everyday gestures intrinsic to a particular geography. These are extracted from our bodies, our memory muscle disappears, and the transmission of knowledge stops once an extractivist infrastructure comes, and there's not the possibility to embody this knowledge anymore because the river is not there as we know it anymore. And so these common goods, these accumulated knowledge, which is a common good, is ultimately what gets extracted through infrastructural and extractivist projects. When I work with communities, I like to call that process a spiritual fieldwork. Of course, being very rigorous about the collection of information through image taking, conversations, but also it's a way for me to get closer and to commit to certain struggles in the front lines of environmental justice. I'm interested in doing fieldwork that does not mimic these extractivist approaches. And definitely the conversations and the time and the relationships I develop with these communities and with particular people inform my work and my aesthetic decisions. And I think, it's also a process of contributing to an aesthetics of the commons, precisely. During fieldwork, in my case, it's about taking refuge in the collective. And also it's a spiritual process that underpins a connection with a place and with the people who belong in that place. Here you can see I'm with Zoila, a very good friend and an excellent fisherwoman from the Yuma River, affected by El Quimbo Dam in southern Colombia, and Jimena, two amazing environmental leaders from the region. And I went fishing for the first time with Zoila, casted my first net with Zoila. And in some of the conversations I had with her, she would tell me that when she would go out into protest, she would carry the Colombian flag upside down. And for those that you have been in direct action, this is a common gesture. You carry the flag upside down in, as inconformity, as a gesture of inconformity and of resistance. And so after that conversation, I was editing back in the editing table, and I thought, well, I'm going to flip the image of the river upside down too. As a gesture of inconformity, and this really opened a possibility of cinematic language. But also, I started to understand that the river, a river that flows upwards, cannot be dammed as we know it, no? And that I had been also complicit in the construction of colonial gaze through the representation of nature, through formats such as landscape, for example. And so out of this, this first initial gesture of flipping the river upside down and starting to understand the river not as an image to be represented, but actually as a living being with the agency to change the course of events, started working on a series of works that I consider water portraits, and trying to also unlearn this format of landscape and understanding that how, as artists, we have been complicit in the construction of colonial gazes all over the world. And so I think also through this process of portraying waters or portraying plants, it's a way of developing and underpinning a relationship with a particular body of water, sometimes with a particular bend of the river, with a particular waterfall. But it also takes us to the construction of complex cartographies, if you wish, in processes of hacking the view of power or hacking the view from above, which kind of erases any biocultural diversity that can exist over a territory. So I'm interested in, through the process of image making, in complexifying a territory and actually not presenting a simplistic or reductive image of this territory. How can we create images that represent also our spiritual connections to a place, or that can map out things that are not measurable? I think we have the capacity as artists to do that. So in the process of this unlearning of the gaze, unlearning of landscape, committing to collective processes of environmental action and of visual activism, if you wish, I started understanding that as artists, we have the skills through the construction or deconstruction of images to contribute to the construction of environmental historical memory. And yesterday we heard something about the possibility of telling our own stories, and this is what I call historical memory. In places like Colombia, where there has been an ongoing armed conflict for decades, to tell our own stories, and moreover with the prism of environmentalism, to tell and to build environmental historical memory is an important tool of victims and survivors to hold perpetrators accountable and to seek for reparations. And in this sense, when we think about the construction of environmental historical memory, we can start thinking about nature not only as a scenario of the war in Colombia or in other parts of the world, but also as a victim of the world in need of reparations too, as any other victim or survivor. And in this sense, this is important, no? The generation of collective bodies through art making, and the contribution to environmental historical memory is a way to also visually articulate other forms of violence that are not so easy to see, such as intergenerational violence or slow violence. So this is what I've been working the last decade, and now, understanding that dams are part of a mining energetic model that is a dictatorial model that's imposed over communities and native people and native nations and sovereign nations, I'm interested in learning more about what are the communities proposing, what are the common dreams of dignity and sustenance, and how can we steer away from a mineral-intensive future and a corporate energy transition. In a way, this is, for me, a process of coming back home. And I think that was mentioning yesterday, coming back home, coming back. A 2020 World Bank report called Minerals for Climate Action, the Mineral Intensity of the Clean Energy Transition, finds that the production of minerals such as graphite, lithium, cobalt, aluminum, vanadium, indium, zinc, manganese, silver, neodymium, titanium, nickel, chromium, molybdenum, lead, steel, gold, and copper will increase by nearly 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. It estimates that over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy wind, solar, and geothermal power, as well as energy storage required for achieving a below 2-degree future. It's eminent to study at what is happening in the territories with large deposits of these minerals. Think about the Mexican-US border in Arizona that has huge copper deposits, and where the border is being militarized, where land and water defenders are imprisoned and legally harassed by practicing their ritual beliefs. Think about what's happening in Ukraine that has deposits of manganese, graphite, sulfur, titanium, nickel, and mercury. Think about the lithium triangle in South America, where a coup kicked out Evo Morales and the Mas government a couple of years ago. So how can we steer away from a mineral-intensive future and corporate energy transition and come back home instead? So I'm in the process of doing fieldwork in different parts of Abya Yala. In January, I had the privilege of being in Chile for a couple of weeks. And I think this country is setting a great example. where a democratic process imposed by direct action has seen activist members of land and water defense movements participate of the electoral process and actually reclaim political seats at the level of presidency, but also regionally and municipal levels, where the rewriting of the constitution is happening, where the rewriting of water laws in Chile is happening. The hope, the tenderness, the level of denouncement of the walls in Santiago or Valparaíso is something I've never experienced before. I spent some time specifically in Tierra del Fuego, these images in southern Patagonia, where there's conservation efforts around the peat bog, and Professor Spivak was speaking yesterday about the peat as the mud that lets us breathe. I love that. And so peat bog territories in southern California, in southern Patagonia, in Tierra del Fuego, are witnessing, and I was there and I was witnessing how processes of tolerance and democracy are being built from practices saddled between conservation science, socially committed art, and the reaffirmation of knowing and being indigenous Shelknam, despite the rhetoric of extinction and the lack of recognition by the Chilean state of this indigenous group in Chile. And so also witnessing how the ecosystems, the peat bog in this case, is embracing these intergenerational practices and above all sustaining them. I've been looking also, well, it was very important to me to be a witness and an accomplice of this very special practice and exercise. And I've been privileged also with the opportunity to ruminate on how to contribute and compose an environmental historical memory of this place, of this moment in Chile, in relationship to other democratic processes that are so unique, special, and intentional, and that are happening in other ecosystems of Abya Yala, or the Americas at large. And I'm thinking about processes of undamming, which are happening in the Pacific Northwest, in the United States, such as the undamming of the Elwha River that happened over the last decade, and the imminent undamming of the Klamath River in Northern California, where 4 dams are going to come down, and the major river restoration project in the world is unfolding right now. And how can we think more broadly about fair energy transition? So energy transition, and a fair one, is not only about how to produce new ways of electricity to keep this sustainable rate of production, but we have to think more broadly about it. And energy transition means undamming oppressive infrastructures and obsolete infrastructures, like decommissioning dams, like what is happening in the Pacific Northwest, conservation initiatives related to these undamming, and all this undamming is happening also with the intent of conserving wild salmon, which is in the brink of extinction in these territories. Looking at conservation initiatives that are led by indigenous and native nations, processes of land back, for example, and small-scale and community-driven life projects that look at ancestral technologies such as the Chinampas in Xochimilco, who are developing agroecology projects to feed the city of Mexico, or small biodigesters, solar electric grids that are community-driven, or even processes of energy sovereignty within a decolonial framework that's being led by women in Puerto Rico today. So the sphagnum, and I'm about to wrap up, which is the moss that makes the peat bog, is a visual key to exist in the world, to be absorbent, to be porous, to be unisexual and sensual, a being that manipulates the environment to take care of it, to moisten it, a being composed of living and dead layers, but that even in its dead phase absorbs and captures the carbon that has us overheated. What are the bridges that as artists we can weave, the portals that we can connect, the gatherings, workshops, and assemblies to organize? How to contribute to an aesthetics of the commons, a commons that is being rebuilt by folks who risk their lives by doing so. Every year, the number of murdered environmentalists grows, be in Colombia, Mexico, Philippines, and Brazil, the most dangerous countries. The fire, the peat, the forest, the rivers, the fish, the sphagnum, the rain, and the shelknam, like me, like us, are entities with the agency to change the course of events. I want to share my dreams with these entities. I want to weave a spiral of shared dreams from the tip of the northwest coast of Abya to Tierra del Fuego. And I want to stop being a threat, and I want to become a promise.
Thanks so much for that, Caro. And thank you to Hur, Kasimi, and all the organizers who helped put this together. It's an honor to be here and to speak with you. I'm going to offer more of a conceptual and political approach to the topic of the panel, which is the environment, climate, and global warming in the Anthropocene. And I think it will complement some of what we've just heard. I'm also very sorry that John Akomfrah won't be joining us. He's not feeling well. I hope he gets better quickly. We're in an emergency of emergencies with a conflict of environmentalisms. It's a geopolitical dissensus challenging us to comprehend on an analytical level, let alone as a politics. There's little agreement at all scales from local environmentalism, which, from the position of anti-capitalists, abolitionists, decolonials, risks, in its worst cases, lapsing into nativist and anti-migrant and organicist eco-fascisms, to global climate governance, which, from the same critical positions, veers towards technocratic solutionism, post-democratic authoritarianism, and fossil capitalist denialism. Whether it's a carbon emergency of global warming, hailing a universalist we, or one of social justice, anti-racism, anti-carcerality, anti-militarism, or an emergency of species extinction, urban toxicity, plastics and micropolymers, or migration, or economic inequality. It's ultimately this idea of what kind of emergency we're talking about is ultimately a false choice, itself a kind of liberal privilege. Thinking within and between these emergencies, I want to propose, is crucial as we face not simply the near future of climate catastrophe, but a climate catastrophe going back centuries, where climate necessarily entangles the biogeophysical with the sociopolitical, the techno-economic, and cultural. It insists that we recompose the we of climate emergency beyond its deep politicized liberalism. The problem with narrow-minded environmentalisms is that they disavow entanglements of trans-environmental crises and equally anti-systemic analyses, failing to recognize the long history of climate breakdown as a cause and consequence of racial and colonial capitalism. But other analytics can and must prevail, as Melanie Yazzie of the Red Nation contends. Climate justice began in 1492 with the conquest of the Americas. And Christina Sharp speaks of the total climates of anti-blackness. And Fred Moten and Stefano Harney of modernity's constitution in the transatlantic slave trade, settler colonialism, and capital's emergence in and with the state, which for them is the socio-ecological disaster. Once we allow climate emergency to be an emergency of atmospheric carbon alone, we've lost half the battle. This conflict of the emergency of emergencies, for anyone paying attention, has emerged in the Anthropocene's dating controversy, whether it begins with the Industrial Revolution, the nuclear age, or the mid-20th century Great Acceleration, or with the Orbis spike, identifying the 16th century colonization of the Americas, and between 1492 and 1610, the destruction of approximately 50 million indigenous people by hunger, forced labor, disease, and outright murder. provoking the regrowth of Amazonia, and in turn the consequent absorption of atmospheric carbon, registered as a signal in the stratigraphic record. The differences between emphasizing a technocratic genealogy dissociated from socio-political histories of imperialism and associated genocidal violence, which Catherine Youssef has termed white geology, or a narrative of anthropo-supremacist carnage at the nexus of climate transformation as a telos of colonial domination. In this latter case, transformation of climates meant not only remaking natures according to plantation systems of early industrial modernity, as much as interventions in its racialized and social relations with the imposition of rigid hierarchies of gender and heteronormativity, and agricultural rationalization, but also the omnicidal supremacy of the human above all else, including restrictions on who qualified as human in the first place. In other words, locating the Anthropocene in colonial violence makes it impossible to dividing global environmental transformation from the militarist capitalist war machine of colonial extractivism, indigenous genocide, and transatlantic slavery. Making this point was one central motivation behind my short polemic against the Anthropocene, where the against signified opposition to the terminological and conceptual understanding of the Anthropocene within geological as much as cultural discourse, as narrowly circumscribed, meaning technocratic, anthropocentric, and tacitly deeply ideological. In one, disavowing the differentiated impacts of climate breakdown that unevenly distribute violence among racialized, impoverished, and disenfranchised populations, and two, portraying Anthropocene responsibility as if it's a matter of speciesist universality. For instance, in Dipesh Chakrabarty's neo-humanist argument. Rather, I propose, along with many others, that terms like the racial capitalocene are much more accurate and more politically enabling, which, to quote Françoise Vergès' key contribution, will help us understand that climate change is not about human hubris, but the result of the long history of colonialism and racial capitalism and its Promethean thinking. The idea that man, in quotes, can invent a mechanical, technical solution to any problem. The key, then, is to think geology beyond this lens, rather than accept its technocratic specialization, devoid of socio-political concern, according to which the colonial is very much not post, but ever active, if historically mutated, in its so-called afterlives. That said, and despite much generative and engaging Anthropocene research in the social sciences, in the arts and humanities, it's the largely technocratic and depoliticized, even anti-political approaches that have come to dominate discussions in natural science research, as well as in governmental policy and engineering and design applications that take up the term Anthropocene. In fact, enormous resources, leagues beyond what's available to the arts and humanities, are going into geoengineering as the favored approach to climate change mitigation, solar radiation management being, despite claims to the contrary, an absolutely frightening step toward a prefigurative global climate system in which climate tellingly contracts to the biogeophysical, and the so-called good Anthropocene becomes the eco-modernist aim of global Earth systems design, at the convergence of billionaire venture capital, IT industry, cybernetics, and algorithmic governance, and elite research university public-private partnerships, which is today operative internationally. It's what I've called the neoliberalization of the Anthropocene, subjugating earth caretaking to the logic of privatization, deregulation, and capitalist growth. Design collectives like the Moscow-based Strelka Institute and its terraforming project are adding further imperative to what is ultimately a technocratization of post-political Anthropocene geoengineering, insisting, according to narrowly defined emergency thinking, exclusively focused on decarbonization, that social justice commitments and even democratic process be swept aside in favor of developing the geotechnology to stop cascading climate disaster. They advocate that geotechnology, based upon fully automated algorithmic techno-natures, must precede geopolitics in order to guarantee a viable planetarity. Global climate governance, represented by, for instance, the UN climate summits, follows a similar script, forwarding market interests and false techno-solutions above all else, including placing bets on our planet's future by leveraging climate-repairing technology that doesn't even exist today, and paying mere lip service to equity and social justice. Meanwhile, militarism and security industry economics remain exempt in general from UN proposed carbon budgets, even while the US Department of Defense emissions are larger than many nation states, as the US military and its analogs unleash untold violence worldwide through its post-9/11 endless wars and the militarization of everyday life, through border control, carceral capitalism, and its toxic subjectivizations across all manner of race, gender, and sexuality. Ultimately, the neoliberal Anthropocene is not the failure of climate governance, but its long-standing objective, the result of capital's centuries-old fundamental laws of motion, a logic that views environmental crisis not as a crisis of life, justice, and civilizational viability, but rather one more source of financializing risk, debt, and vulnerability, in the interests of elite wealth capture, profit maximization, according to the geopolitical logic of what others have called disaster capitalism, which also entails growing security apparatuses and militarization in order to defend those interests against increasingly restive multitudes, aware that the promises of technological modernity are failing them. Current pathologies of billionaire escape fantasies, whether in the form of real estate financialized post-nuclear bunkers or libertarian seasteading island retreats to survive an apocalyptic future, or exodus to Mars, or space colonies, or into the virtual post-human worlds of NFT, or MMORPG, or metaverse phantasmagorias, all are symptomatic of both the psychotic disavowal of the earthly realities of capital's own making, as well as of the real exterminist and elemental implications of capital's destruction of the planet and its finite resources. So what is there to do? The only viable solution is an intersectionalist, social justice-based eco-socialism, which is the resolve to exterminationist capitalism. It's clear capitalism can't solve the problems of capitalism in the interests of capitalism. Rather, something else entirely different, something structurally other, is necessary. Drawing on a multi-pronged genealogy of political theory, going back to the original critical analysis of capitalism's death machine, according to Marx and Engels' study of its alienating social forms, its self-destructive ecology, and its economy of insatiable growth, to the black radical tradition and its critical interrogation of racial capitalism, its contributions to anti-capitalist intersectionality and carceral and police abolition, and to the decolonial program for radical system change from indigenous revolutionary coalitions like the Red Nation, what some call the Green, Red, Black New Deal, the only politics worthy of our belief in emancipation, including from the neoliberal Anthropocene, is an anti-systemic or anti-capitalist trans-environmentalism. This approach opposes piecemeal single-issue politics, whether technocratic design approaches or market-based mechanisms to reducing atmospheric carbon according to narrowly conceived understandings of climate, as much as it challenges the liberal identity politics that turns DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, into corporate publicity, where anti-racism fails to connect to anti-anthropocentrism, anti-capitalism, and necessarily multiracial working class labor and climate justice struggles. In a compelling recent essay entitled Climates of Capital, the philosopher Nancy Fraser argues compellingly that climate justice must be anti-systemic, that is, anti-capitalist, and trans-environmental, looping in the inextricable economic and socio-political elements of the present crisis. Trans-environmental concerns, for her, include tackling livelihood insecurity and denial of labor rights, public disinvestment from social reproduction and chronic undervaluation of care work, ethno-racial imperial oppression and gender and sex domination, dispossession, expulsion and exclusion of migrants, militarization, political authoritarianism, and police brutality. Opposing all of these interlinking formations and their basis in racialized difference and colonial oppression must be the overarching goal of a comprehensive anti-Anthropocene climate justice. Fraser recognizes that capitalism is never not racial. Just as Angela Davis argues the same, and accordingly, the Red Nation, capital is never not colonial. The only real option in addressing climate emergency as an intersectionalist emergency of racial and colonial capitalism and thinking beyond the dominant economic regime is this. If the resolution to racial capitalism is anti-racist socialism, according to Charisse Burden-Stelly, then along the same lines, I argue, the resolution to ecocidal capitalism must be eco-socialism. Drawing on innovative and experimental aesthetic forms, current artistic practice provides a range of resources for an anti-racial capitalocene convergence. Ones that come to mind include those that bring critical attention, testimonial, and forensic analysis to the structural and systemic causality of climate breakdown and its socio-environmental violence, including operating within the juridical political framework, as much as in all manner of cultural spaces, including nonprofit and public ones, or those that offer audiovisual approximations of comprehensive approaches to intersectionalist climate justice and constitute forms of radical education, or those that center creative alternatives offering new images and stories, such as indigenous futurisms and abolitionist projects that inspire horizons of imagination beyond those of fossil capital and its colonial, militarized, and carceral systems of oppression, and those that provide networking infrastructure and agitprop between artists, creative practitioners, militant labor struggles, and social movements, such as, for instance, Strike MoMA in New York or the Progressive International. These and many others all move beyond the captured roles of art as individuated self-expression, producing object-oriented luxury items for elite investment and commercial markets, and toward surging collective participation in climate justice struggles according to the imperatives of collective survival, and more challenging the terms of ecofascisms everywhere and the international reactionary rise of right-wing authoritarian populism. In their most ambitious, that is cosmopolitical, sense. These climate justice anti-Anthropocene engagements do the work of building new worlds beyond the deprivations and depravities of the historical present. Building on art's communicational and affective capacities, they show and more encourage us to feel and sense what a socially equitable and ecologically sustainable future looks like. But we know that these, that is, art's manifold interventions, are still not enough, even if they're a necessary component of something still bigger. The real challenge is in actual socio-political and material transformations, requiring doing the work of building collective power capable of bringing about a great transformation. Because we know that transnational corporate and elite economic and political interests are invested in the status quo of fossil capital and will use everything at their disposal to prevent meaningful change. Artistic practice, whether as the representation of politics, showing alternative possibilities, or as the politics of representation, inventing new imaginative forms for relaying experience, will not be enough to confront these vested interests. Which is why, increasingly, it's necessary to consider art as an expanded field of engagements, intersecting, collaborating with, and connecting to social movements, dedicated to massive transformation, as multiracial class struggle against climate collapse. Even if this building of power comes too late, even if we fall deeper into a militarized and toxic planet of colonial violence, racial division, and the impoverishment of the many, even if we have to confront collapsing opportunities for meaningful change, I don't think that those of us committed to an altogether different world have any choice but to continue to struggle. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for Carolina and TJ for their very thoughtful talks. I'd like also to start my presentation, thank the Sharjah Art Foundation for inviting me to take part at this at this panel today. So today I'm going to talk about specific work I made in 2019. Thank you. In 2019, called Final Flight. And it is essentially a story about a bird. But when reading it carefully, it has historical, religious, ecological, and geopolitical elements. I will leave it to you to make up your own mind, but here is the story. The bird in question is the northern bald ibis. This is one of the rarest birds in the region and actually in the world. It has been on the critically endangered red list of the IUCN, International Union for Conservation Nature, since 1994. The decline of this bird species from its original breeding range is part of a large wave of biodiversity loss that has occurred here in the region during the past 30-40 years. At a time when several other species of iconic animals and plants became extinct. Also called the ancient guide of Hajj, the ibis has significant symbolic and cultural values tied to the region. In ancient Egypt, the sacred ibis was considered the herald of the annual rising of the Nile, and they were depicted 5,200 years ago in the oldest Egyptian hieroglyphs found. The hieroglyph of the northern bald ibis represented the word Ach, which stood for the form in which the deceased occupies the afterlife. Thoth, god of wisdom, knowledge, and writing, was commonly depicted with the head of an ibis. The ibis was depicted in many forms in Egypt. The ibis was depicted in many forms of Egyptian art, including wall murals, sculptures, and jewelry. Thousands of mummified ibises have been also found at burial sites. In the Old Testament, ibises were legendary messengers of fertility, released by Noah from the ark. While Muslims believed that migrating birds guided the pilgrims during their Hajj towards Mecca. In Syria, the bird had not been seen since the 1930s. The last known wild colony was located in southern Anatolia and officially declared extinct in 1989. So you can imagine the disbelief when a young Italian ornithologist, Gianluca Serra, went to Syria, to the Syrian desert near Palmyra in the early 2000s, and local Bedouins told him a story about a bird he was not expecting.
An ancient city in the Syrian desert. Ruins litter this arid landscape, evidence of the long line of empires that once ruled the region. This distinct bird once also reigned supreme here. The northern bald ibis was common across the Middle East and North Africa, a symbol of wisdom to the Bedouins that roam the desert. Now, less than 300 bald ibises are left in the wild. Nearly all far from here in Morocco. Some believe them completely extinct in Syria for more than 70 years. But National Geographic researcher Gianluca Serra has made a startling discovery. He and a team of local hunters, Bedouins, and conservationists have found a small group of bald ibises summering here in Syria's Al-Badia desert.
Il culmine, di questo lavoro, 3 anni di sopralluoghi e esplorazione del deserto, è stata la scoperta.
The apex of this work, 3 years of explorations in the desert, was the discovery of this very rare bird, the bald ibis, classified as critically endangered by the IUCN, an international authority in the field of conservation biology. This means that the short-term chances for its extinction are very high.
There are only 7 birds, but they form an active breeding colony, genetically unique from the ibises in far-off Morocco. But this fragile population, just found, is already in danger of being lost for good. In this huge desert, sheep may seem inconsequential, but these eating machines have an impact on an arid ecosystem. And their owners are increasing in population too. The region's desert dwellers often pull up shrubs to create fuel for fire, stripping bare the desert's already fragile soil. So how can these rare ibises be protected? Gianluca is organizing Bedouins like Ahmed to mount an around-the-clock watch on the ibis's nesting sites. But to ensure they're protected year-round, Gianluca wants to know where they go when they migrate away from Al-Badia in the winter. To find out, he's brought in a wizard of satellite telemetry, Lubomir Pesky.
Our protection here in the breeding areas is not sufficient. We need to know where they are going and also try to protect them during the second half of the year, during the winter.
Their original plan is to outfit 2 of the ibises with radio transmitters. The devices will allow scientists to track the birds' migratory routes. But to attach the transmitters, They must first catch the birds. Rebele constructs a trap that will capture the ibises without harming them.
We are ready to trap those animals. I think that we develop trap and these birds are already going and visiting every day, regularly visiting drinking point. And so if we install our trap close to this drinking point, we certainly can catch them.
But at the last minute, they receive some disappointing news. Syrian authorities have not approved their request to outfit the ibises with transmitters.
Purtroppo quest'anno eravamo arrivati a un passo.
Unfortunately, this year, we were very close to accomplishing our goals. We were able to overcome all the trapping-related obstacles, but now a number of bureaucratic and political problems arose.
It's a setback, but John Luca and his team hopes it will only be temporary. They will be here next year when the ibises return. Now that this small population of rare birds has been discovered, they won't be lost without a fight. Bedouins like Ahmed are ready to help monitor the ibis' survival. With their vigilance, the so-called Arab phoenix may reign supreme in the Syrian desert once again.
So I must point out here that it took almost 2 years to Gianluca actually to believe the Bedouins, which shows also how indigenous and local knowledge is not always valued. So back to the story. When in 2002 this surviving colony of 7 birds was discovered near Palmyra, there were 2 choices, as shown in the film. Keep it a secret or make it sure they get valued and protected locally. They chose this last one. And the tiny new colony was intensively studied and protected with support of the Syrian government. There is one big problem when protecting a long-range migratory bird like the northern bald ibis. They travel long distances and spend the winter elsewhere. So for a protection plan to work, there needs to be a protection at the other end, and also the route. First, it took time to figure out exactly what that route was and where they ended up. The black flocks flying in formation over the desert horizon would travel back and forth twice a year, crossing 7 countries. Starting from Palmyra in July, they would fly southward for several days along western Saudi Arabia before taking a break. Then they moved into Yemen for a second break, continuing their flight over the Mandeb Strait, crossing Djibouti and Eritrea, until they reached their final destination in the middle of the Ethiopian highlands. 6 months later, they would return through a slightly different, more northward road over the south coast of Sudan, crossing the Red Sea, until they reached the town of Lith in western Saudi Arabia, where they would rest before continuing on their journey to Palmyra. Despite the intensive conservation efforts in Syria, protecting turned out to be almost impossible. And the number of adult breeding pairs returning to Palmyra every springtime declined from 3 pairs in 2002 to only 1 pair in 2010. The main reason? Illegal hunting and electrocution by power cables on the bird's migratory route. For example, a young female tagged in 2009, Julia, was shot on her first day of migration. And this is the picture of Julia stuffed. And then, In 2011, the war broke out in Syria. This created a sudden major restraint on the Palmyra conservation program, although trained local rangers continued on their own for the first years. Between 2013 and 2014, only 3 birds were seen at the wintering site in Ethiopia. In springtime 2014, only Zenobia, a mature female ibis, who was the last one to know the migratory route, returned to Palmyra, and that same year, Palmyra was destroyed. It was the last time the northern bald ibis was seen in the skies of the Syrian desert. It is now almost exactly 11 years ago that the brutal war broke out in Syria, a conflict with ramifications far beyond its borders. In this time, by conservative estimate, 400,000 people have been killed, while millions of Syrians have abandoned their homes, seeking shelter and peace across the borders through treacherous crossings over water or over land. The ripple effects will be felt by generations to come. The story of the northern bald ibis could be their story. I started working on Final Flight in 2018, and I contacted Gianluca, and Gianluca very kindly, I first contacted the British National History Museum in London to get a sample, a skull, so we can 3D the skull, and then I start working, but it was very difficult process to go, a very bureaucratic process, so I asked Gianluca to help me, and Gianluca kindly, he put me in touch with a very small zoo in Andalusia, and he introduced me to Miguel, and Miguel sent me these pictures of almost 20 skulls of northern bald ibis to pick one and do the 3D scanning. So I built up this installation work, which consists 7 skulls of northern bald ibis, and this is how the story begins. And we made a mold out of, and there is also a piece which is it's an aluminium panel which shows the migratory route. And this line in the middle, which is cut through, it's for me, it looks more like a noose. And next to it, there is also a video which is 9 hours, and it is, thank you, and which is the migratory route of the bird from Palmyra until the highlands of Ethiopia. And we recorded on the same height of when the bird flies and the same angle that the bird had while flying. And this was how the work was shown here in Sharjah last year. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those fantastic presentations. So I'm now going to try to summarize the talks of Carolina, TJ, and Hrair. I just wanted to highlight a couple of points which I think are quite crucial to our attempt here to think about the Anthropocene, both in terms of its waning relevance, from what we can tell, particularly from TJ's talk, but also to think about the ways in which art and aesthetic practices can provide different kind of openings, to think about eco-socialism and similar ideas that can move us forward. So, Carolina Caycedo draws our attention to how dams have transformed the physical landscape and turned social lives into landscapes of profit, the consequences on communities' capacity to connect with nature and to sustain lives and meaningful, dignified lives are tremendous, as she shows in her talk. TJ Demos's invitation is for us to revisit the entanglements of climate catastrophe with long sedimented processes of dislocation and dehumanization meted out on countless lives, from racial capitalism to state violence, from militarized extractivism to ecocidal practices. For Demos, capitalism is an exterminationist system, and there is nothing absolutely redeemable about it. Hrair, Sarkissian, on the other hand, even though he does not specifically focus on the environment per se, I think he echoes some of the concerns that TJ has raised. He seeks to refocus our attention to the specific migration cycle and the body of the Bald Ibis. War and environmental disaster do provide a background to Hrair's story. Through his installation, he reconstitutes not only bodies, migration routes, but also the decimated landscape along those routes. I thought I would try to find one kind of connecting line of thought across the three talks. And it seems to me that beyond shared concerns about the dislocations of life, beyond concerns about the dehumanization, it seems to me that all speakers seem to hanker for what I would call sites of affiliations that might have been lost in the different spaces that you have inquired. And I guess my question would be for you to think a bit more, and I guess Carolina does this a little bit in the way in which she talks about how art does allow people to reconnect or to engage in different forms of reconnecting. So I guess my question would be, how do you think that art and aesthetic practices can help reconstitute such sites of affiliation? If I was to put this question differently, I would try and ask you to think about how aesthetic practices can help us think about a notion of global commons. And one can think about it in a very broad term, but also in ways that are brought back to the importance of one single life here, for example, a bird, and how its extinction tell us a lot more than just birds disappearing because of all kinds of phenomena. So that would be the question I would like to ask all three.
I think art on its own perhaps has a difficult to reconstitute sites of affiliation, or if it can, it can do it partially. I think it's important as artists to participate of interdisciplinary working groups. So that's what I definitely try to do, and through what I know what to do, which is to build or unbuild images, be part of larger processes of this reconstitution of affiliations, either by supporting local agendas of, anti-dam struggle or dam decommissioning or conservation of peat bogs. So yeah, I think, the art structure, the art world as we know it is very hegemonic and elitist. And however, it is a place to discuss and bring forward issues, in this case environmental issues, or the emergency of climate collapse. So art institutions are locations to the museum, the gallery, even the art fair, to speak about these things. And I have that very clear, and I try to hold this nudge to speak about these things, and that's why I don't exit the art world totally, because I think we need to hold the ground there too, before it flips totally to the other side. But at the same time, for me, it's important to participate in movements of territorial resistance, and in movements of energy sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, land back movements. And this is where I really get the inspiration. It's the people in the front lines that have the sophistication, the political sophistication, the knowledge to challenge language, to challenge oppressive concepts, through everyday gestures and through extraordinary gestures that sometimes inhabit educational practices or legal structures. But ultimately, definitely, I do think that cultural work does touch upon a part of our lives that perhaps other kind of more technical aspects or more academic aspects have it more difficult. The emotion, the building of empathy. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we do have that tool as cultural workers, and we have to use it more and more.
Thank you very much. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I think Carolina's answer is really great and comprehensive. I don't have a lot to add to that. I think art is a site of struggle, and it's infinite in terms of the approaches that we can invent and imagine and participate in, and it's under threat in terms of like institutions of capture. And so it's a kind of place where we're struggling for a different kind of world. So without that struggle, it's in danger of simply offering a kind of emancipatory imagination, but that is itself paradoxically imprisoning. So without an attachment to actual social, economic, and political formations and the struggle that occurs within everyday life, we're really in a very difficult place. So I was trying to position art within a larger framework of what we're witnessing today, a kind of ongoing disaster of climate collapse within the expanded understanding of what climate means, and ultimately, it's a matter of survival. I think we can't simply look to art as a redemptive site that we can somehow gain a new world from. It's rather something that we have to invest in, again, on the level of an ongoing social, collective grassroots struggle. And that it can't be ultimately displaced, I think, from thinking about other categories of political forms, specifically class and race. Art is just thoroughly embedded within those conditions that are also historical. So if we're going to escape from the kind of potential future that we already see one version of in terms of the biological annihilation of the northern bald ibis, I think that's going to take not just imagining a different world, but doing everything within our power to struggle to realize other forms of living. Ultimately, that means for me beyond the dominant economic regimes of today that are attempting to propose false solutions in the form of technology, green capitalism, modes of automation that take us away, that abstract us, that divide us, and create conditions where we turn into simply consumers or thinking about art as detached from material sites of struggle.
Thank you, TJ. If I could just add, perhaps, so you started your talk with a critique of the Anthropocenic, viewpoint, and you ended with a discussion about art and aesthetic practices. Was that a way to think of those as potentially providing a language to repoliticize, discussions around the environment and so on?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Amy. I think for me, the bigger point that I was trying to make was that after being involved with lots of, teaching and research around the possibilities of politicized artistic forms, it becomes eventually very frustrating to simply continue to argue that art has some kind of redemptive politics. That is, within dominant, hegemonic, elite institutions, for instance, including university systems, as well as museums and galleries and the rest. So the point that I was trying to make is that for art to have any kind of real radical claims, it has to be reconnected to actual social struggle. And the kind that, for instance, Carolina was talking about in relationship to anti-dam struggles that are geographically located, often indigenous-led, and attempting to stop the destruction of worlds. Like there's a radical imagination that is in part aesthetic, sometimes it's artistic, embedded within those struggles. But it can't just be that, right? It has to be attached to the actual work of struggles, as people all over the world are doing. And it's in the name of survival that they're doing it. So the point that I was trying to make is to resist abstracting the radical claims of the aesthetic imagination by relocating it and embedding it firmly and materially and socially within conditions of struggle.
Thank you. Hrair?
I totally agree what TJ said. It's also, I witnessed a couple of months ago, I went to Damascus, and it's been 11 years for me going back home. I don't think, being an artist, and I couldn't even show this work over there if I had the chance to, because people are really struggling to survive on a daily basis, and it's really hard to come up and do something, even if you are trying to do something, showing a problem or helping, or I find it really a very difficult time. And frame also, they don't have the platform already to stand up on their feet.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we have just about 20 minutes for Q&A. I see one question there in the middle.
Thank you to you all, and a shout out to the organizers who curated such a wonderfully synergetic panel. I thought all of your talks and presentations connected to one another, and wanted to ask each of you a question, if I may, beginning with Carolina. You said that your art installations for you were a process of unlearning. And so, right, the inversion of the river and it flowing upstream, and then it was juxtaposed to the images of young people who are so much more attuned to climate change, and I would imagine sympathetic to indigenous knowledge as knowledge for the future. So how have you had an experience of kind of the youthful reaction to your works and also unlearning in that moment? What has that been? For TJ, I wonder, in your discussion, I couldn't agree with you more on all of your connections of rooting, right? This discussion about climate doom in capitalism, in racism, in these structures. And I wonder, just as your own thought process on the connection between the rise of right-wing chauvinistic nationalism and climate doom as perhaps a mode of mutually exclusive survival. That, that this move to the right is not just a political reaction, but a reaction of, if some of us must survive, then it will be this particular group. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And then for Hrair, I was also struck, like as Amy was, in the mapping of the extinction of the ibis and the landscape and the destruction of Palmyra, and how both of these things basically are destroyed as a result of our either lack of care or too much intervention. And yet you didn't comment on it very much. And I wonder, what was that process like for you in the creative process of mapping the destruction of Palmyra? Was the noose also wrapped around that? And do you see also a phoenix rising in Assyrian civilization and Arab civilization on those grounds, like the bird itself?
Actually, during the entire 11 years and when the war started in Syria, I tried to avoid concentrating on the destruction of as a result of the war and what's happening in Syria. And when I did this project about the bird, there was so much resonance for me and connection with the Syrians themselves. As leaving their homes and being killed and suffering and losing their homes. I literally, I didn't, today it's the first time I combined these images of Palmyra destroyed in a presentation in this project. And it's really, it's very painful for me to do this and also to talk about it. And I was saying today, when I went back to Damascus, it felt like you met, someone and you met the person after 15 years, and you see the person how the facial characters has changed dramatically. You don't recognize the person anymore. And this is exactly what happened to me when I first went to Damascus in last December. And I literally wanted to move, to leave as soon as I could. But I couldn't because I wanted to see my family too. It was very difficult decision for me to go back, but I had to do it.
Thanks for that question. I use the term ecofascism within my talk, and just to unpack that a little bit briefly, right? That we're seeing what that means recently, the bringing together of environmental concerns, say for conservation or organic types of discourse, together with racist, anti-migrant, xenophobic formations. Where I'm coming from in California, in the United States, there's a growing kind of eco-fascist formation. That's not an extremist term. It's actually happening. People are dying. People are suffering as a result of this. The formation of white supremacy together with environmentalism. It's also international. It's not always necessarily white supremacists in the same way in different places. But certainly this is a real danger. It's the way the growing authoritarian right wing is using environmentalism not simply as a matter of climate denial, although that still happens and continues, but as a kind of political opportunism of biopolitics, or the management of populations, or even the extermination or elimination or deportation of populations. What we've seen under Trumpism in the States and its specter, which definitely is ongoing and threatens in the near future, to internationalist formations of ecofascism. I think this is a real danger of green capitalism that it's all too frequently not discussed or addressed. It's something that we're seeing carried out already in the context of Palestine, where environmentalism is weaponized and used against people, Palestinians, in order to bring together a kind of history of conservationism that has long been anti-indigenous and exterminationist, together with a kind of green eco-politics. It's a real danger, and I think it's something I wanted to identify that goes often hand in hand with a kind of techno-determinist futurity that we're seeing with people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, a billionaire future. And we have to ask, who's going to be, who will survive in that future, who will not survive, who will be defutured. I think these are key, critical political questions that we need to be thinking about today.
Thank you for
The youth, I think, have less fear. That's been the experience, at least with youth in Colombia and Brazil, where I kind of have done more extensive work. They also offer a more queer perspective on a lot of these issues that I find very important, and a more transversal also approach to a lot of the struggle. So they connect quickly to kind of cultural platforms, call it visual art or filmmaking or performance art or puppetry, circus, theater of the oppressed. It's kind of, and I'm thinking more in the context of Colombia or South America, where, processes of theater of the oppressed, for example, have been there for a number of decades, and that has really kind of sunk in a lot of youth movements. You could see it, for example, in the results and the kind of the aesthetics of the protest in Chile or in Colombia during pandemic too. I know the burst of creativity, and I was talking about also that reflects on the walls, the creativity and the wittiness also of the slogans, of the claims, of the reclaims. And also it's the youth, precisely because they have less fear, are the ones that keep me in check more than sometimes the adults too. So where are you going to show this? How is this going to be shown? How are you going to bring it back to the community? When are you coming back? Perhaps because of the major use of technology, a more fluent communication exists there too.
This was a very engaging panel. Thank you very much, both engaging and enriching. So often when we hear about this subject matter, we have the question of the political, emergency, crisis, and community. And sometimes we use those as narrative tropes with the understanding that we all know what all of this means. But we also have to come to the understanding that they're locally and historically specific. So if of you could reflect a bit on what you understand by community. For example, for Carolina, how do you approach your community as a community? What about dissenting voices? Because these are not simple societies. Normally and ideally, you have dissenting voices. How do we capture those and without framing the majority as, the modus operandi of the society? And then for TJ, there was this idea of the political and sometimes the unpolitical. How do we think about neoliberalism and biopolitics as mutually entangled? Is there any moment in which it is not political? So I think it is political through and through, but again, that depends on your conceptualization of what you call political. And then for her, my question was, why didn't you reach out to the Bedouin, or did you try? Why run Carlos and not the Bedouin? Thank you.
So I think about the community, I guess, more in terms of the set of relationships that happen within an ecosystem. So it includes also kind of non-human entities within a place. And sometimes the dissenting voices are not the human ones, but actually the river itself, or the forest, or the fire. So that on one hand. It's hard to engage kind of dissenting voices. It's one of the hardest things. It's hard to not be pointing fingers, more when you want to hold people accountable, and those dissenting voices come also from kind of what you consider the oppressor, for example, that have a set of mind. So that's something that I struggle with a lot, for sure.
Thanks for that question. For me, what I heard is a question about what is the political and how do we identify that, how do we frame it, because it's always specific, it's culturally located, it's historically determined. And I was speaking at, in some ways, at a general level, specifically in relationship to climate emergency and the Anthropocene, and trying to bring a political framework to those subjects, which all too often remain abstract and universalizing, and I think that's part of the problem. So, for instance, climate emergency, the political element that dominates in that subject is a kind of assumed common sense that eliminates or invisibilizes alternative ways of thinking about it, so that we're told repeatedly, and I'm thinking specifically, especially within the Euro-American context, we're told repeatedly that we're in a climate emergency and we're supposed to act, we're supposed to devote our attention to that in some kind of transformative way. But I want to question that as itself filled with all sorts of assumptions that are deeply problematic when you actually begin to think about it. That climate emergency is defined all too often according to this abstract, narrowly understood form of carbonization, atmospheric carbonization, when really there's all sorts of other emergencies that are unfolding on a daily basis, that we live surrounded by these kinds of violences in everyday life. Certainly, I do in California, in Santa Cruz, where I'm coming from. For instance, police violence, anti-homeless violence, economic inequality, and the violence that comes about and is so destructive to any notion of community in my local context. So the challenge then, and this is the politicization that happens, is to, in some ways, reject this kind of assumed commonsensical notion of what we should be devoting our attention to in the first place. It's a kind of like Gramscian, I suppose, definition of politics, but it makes sense to me, I think, especially in relationship to this global climate emergency that is being thrust upon us right now. But the unquestioned assumption of that emergency is that, yes, carbonization, climate change, climate breakdown, species extinction, all the rest of it is definitely a major urgent concern. But how is that emergency thinking at the same time funneling us to certain understandings that accept, for instance, a capitalist future, that accept the conditions of oppression and the causality that produce it without taking issue with that itself? So I'm trying to bring a politicization to Anthropocene discourse and climate change politics, which kind of contradictorily can be even anti-political.
And it just makes me think about the conversation I had with a young environmentalist activist also. She was telling me, like, now all our problems are bagged in this general concept of climate collapse. And now my problems that have to deal with racism, she was a young black woman, systemic racism and, feminist issues, whatnot. Now suddenly they're all bagged within, and my problems are suddenly the same problems as a rich person, white or privileged person in another part of the world, right? I think it has to do with that, and how to avoid also these kind of englobing, concepts that again erase that biocultural diversity that we need to keep alive, I guess.
We can maybe try to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. We have here in the middle. Sorry. You go ahead.
The reason I didn't contact the Bedouins is when I did the project in 2018, all the Bedouins left in 2013 because that's when ISIS entered Palmyra and they destroyed the entire city. Even there were like 2 birds left, they also fled. And they destroyed, that was the main reason. And I couldn't also go back to Syria for military reasons too.
Okay, so there is a question
we have
in the middle.
The guy first, upstairs, over there.
Okay, and there's one, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And my question is for TJ, but I would welcome very much comments from the rest of the panel. You spoke about this need of rejecting the redemptive power of art or value of art and encouraging it to join a struggle in some way. And I wonder whether this means that, or whether there's a risk that whether you're encouraging artists to offer a sort of marketing and communication tool to these struggles. It's probably a provocation. I wonder whether that's something that we want to encourage, because when I listen to the other presentation, I see this ability to come in and out of the struggles and use a language that occasionally aligns with the language of struggle and occasionally comes out and makes it accessible to a much wider audience. And equally, that language can come in and out of an academic language, which is probably less accessible. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and also the rest of the panel.
Okay. We're going to take another question.
So my question is, like, it's more an observation in 2 parts. One is this idea of not flattening or like not collapsing everything under one umbrella, like the climate, and like how that kind of almost makes multiple very like privileged people, various varied privileges and precarities feel like they're on the same side when they're often not. However, there also seems to be a need to think about like trans-boundary events and how like geo-ecologies and choreographies require a kind of thinking that is both local, and how somehow, and the paper that comes to mind is On Difference Without Separability by Dr. Denise Ferreira de Silva, and that idea of being implicated without flattening, just speaking to that, like neither collapsing but not also like precluding the option of solidarity. The other thing was just about the affective, emotional, and psychic toll that this kind of work takes on activists, artists, theorists like yourself, like making things, and how do you account for exhaustion and the labor of constantly like fighting, in a sense.
Thanks for those questions. In terms of the first one, I was in some ways responding in terms of a struggle that I have within myself in relationship to my relation to artistic practice, that I've always found to be, in the best cases, critical, compelling, provocative, raising all sorts of critical questions about how we're living and possible ways of living otherwise. And also, for me, making lots of arguments for art's possibilities. And it's with a growing sense of frustration that I'm shifting course a little bit and thinking more about not just imagining other worlds, but working toward realizing them, which I think is increasingly the challenge and something that we have to think about. And that means ultimately dealing with forms of struggle and practice, and how we connect and think about art within that larger framework of material social struggle. So for me, art it's not one thing, it's like a multiplicity. There's any number of ways of thinking about it. But for instance, the Red Nation, this is an indigenous revolutionary coalition based in Albuquerque and in New Mexico in the United States, but it's a rather amazing formation of collective struggle that is not artistic per se, but it's not unrelated either. It has its own kind of aesthetic element to it, which is simultaneously a matter of building solidarity, working with social struggles, engaging in radical education, spreading propaganda, using agitprop. I think I'm interested in all of those different formations as examples of ways that we can think otherwise about artistic practice outside of the dominant institutions where it often otherwise takes place, offering a radical imagination, but is so easily objectified and commodified. I think that's something that we have to continue to think about and struggle with. And that means also struggling against collapsing and flattening. I think that's definitely true. However, we're dealing with global dynamics economically and politically, this is part of the violence of global capitalism, is that it does abstract, it does collapse. So how can we simultaneously resist that, but also acknowledge it and try to identify how it works, but localize our own struggles in terms of finding ways to work within the contradictions, to bring out emancipatory possibilities. That can be exhausting indeed, and this is a continual subject for me and my friends and comrades. Like, how can we engage in struggle that isn't itself a kind of almost like mirroring forms of extraction, just the endless exertion of energy? How can struggle and politicization be itself a form of reaffirmation of self-care, of community care, and building resilience? This is, I think, I don't know how we do that, but I think this has to be integrated as part of the goal of our activities, so that when we're struggling together, we're not committing ourselves to a kind of endgame of exhaustion. How could it itself be a way of building new worlds, even on the smallest of scales, through relationality and community grassroots struggle?
Trying to address the question about how do you avoid becoming just an instrument for the communication of social movements, or I tend to be very honest of what are the skills I can bring to the agenda, and that's definitely no one, like being a communicator in the terms that they need. They probably need other persons with other skills, so I tend to be very honest in that sense. And also, I'm very careful of maintaining parallel practices, and there's things that happen with the community that I don't have any interest in translating into the white cube or into a commercial setting. And so being very, very careful of what are those practices that happen within the community, with the community, and stay with the community and are for them, and in those kind of more collective spaces. And that can be shared perhaps in a talk, but they don't have any need to exist in a kind of more white cube institutional setting. And in terms of the exhaustion and I don't know, I just compare myself to all of those in the front lines, and what I do is so little in comparison to all those folks that that just like pushes me on, and it's like there's no way I'm close to that level of exhaustion or even life risk levels of of risking your own life by putting your body literally on the front lines of environmental violence. So that keeps me on. And then again, learning to say no to many also invites from the art circuit as well, that, you know, seems to have been taking an environmental turn in the last years, and suddenly there's so much interest in artists and projects without a really proper commitment from the institution or the party that's inviting. So also trying to identify who can really be an ally and go in and take in those opportunities and letting go of the others.
We'll take two I think more, I think I'm next. Am I next?
Here and there. Okay, so we can take then maybe 3 even.
Okay. Thank you for that presentation and those wonderful papers. I'm especially grateful to Hrair's work, which I didn't know before, and I look forward to learning more. So my question is slightly polemical, and I want to sort of veer away from the question that my comrade Nora raised, where she said that she was speaking about the synergy between your talks, and I actually found them incredibly dissonant, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about it. And what I mean by that is that, TJ, your talk was dizzyingly broad, and the other 2 presentations were dizzyingly focused. And one of the challenges for those of us who work in the Global South, and particularly in histories of region, as histories of epistemic shifts, has been the refusal of the dizzyingly general, because that's the argument is that epistemologies of the region produce epistemologies of climate, etc. I understand the conceit, and I know what you were trying to, but I was sort of curious to know what is lost when you do that, when in the kind of generality of concepts that you raised, what does it erase? And how does the other 2 works sit alongside it? Are they exemplars of the kinds of epistemological and political shifts you're charting, or are they also epistemes? And this question is not just for TJ. I was struck by, this is a challenge that all of us who are, work in regions of the Global South have to constantly front, right? Are we fodder for the supply chain, or are we the supply chain, or are we the questions that raise the issues? So anything that you fancy, you don't have to answer the question, but it was something that struck me today as well as yesterday, right? The kind of dissonance between the exemplar and the episteme, as if they were somehow segregated rather than, together. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Anjali. I think that's a great question.
Let's take more.
Okay, so we're going to take another question and then answer.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First and foremost, thank you so much for this. I think as there are a lot of undergraduate students in the room, and I think it's very comforting to be in critical spaces where there's kind of this shared discourse. My question was for Carolina. This is kind of a personal question because I'm going through this process myself. But you mentioned this process of homegoing and how, and I've been thinking about how to work through some of the knots that may come up in homegoing and how that translates into creative practice. I bring this up because I'm from Puerto Rico and my family's from there, and I've been contemplating going home to contribute kind of in this incredible moment politically, where it's been a long history of it, but in supporting our water and land defenders and supporting this decision we're making between statehood and independence that's been ongoing. And I'm finding these knots and how to support home. Should I physically be there, and how to kind of be an extension? So I wanted to know what that looked like for you, and if you could speak on that process.
Thank you so much for this very interesting conversations. And okay, so I want to, it's really interesting because they speak to each other, but they also have, like, for me, my question comes from the panel itself, which kind of, there is an underlying assumption that there exists a struggle. I mean, of course, we do have examples of struggles and examples of the possibilities of documenting extensions, right? Like, for example, with Hrair, and then the necessity of generalizable discussions about the situation. But then I wanted to, especially for TJ, I wanted to know more about, like, I understand this clouding of ideas, for example, how the Anthropocene or even the neoliberal regime could cloud a certain political possibility for political struggle by making it possible for a sort of alternative within the system itself. But then I felt like with one mini research that I did recently, I don't think the local or the community is readily available with the language of struggle that we want it to have. For example, so I actually wanted to hear from three of you. So if there is a community of struggles, and there is a community which struggles, for example, which is under a certain political engagement through the language of land registration, through the language of land grabbing, so the state capture element comes in dictating the ways in which communities are also struggling, but not in anti-climate change or you see, so how do you negotiate between abstracting from the kind of movements or struggles that are happening for not having, like Hrair was saying, for not having even a land to stand on, to struggle for the first place, because that land has been taken away through other ideological grounds which came in form of policy, right? So do you see the state as a radical side also for that struggle to how do you say, to have the conversation for the struggle, or is it the community again going to give that alternative? So I just wanted to see a transaction between the community and the labeling of a community or a local to have an alternative to this disaster. But I think that community, for at least for the fact that I know, is also captured through all of these degradations of thought or policy practices. Even the impossibility of having the land for the farmer has been already in the change, right? So I don't think the farmer is readily available with his knowledge of wanting to keep a certain local knowledge. For me, I haven't seen that, at least from, it's yet to be made. Those languages of struggles are yet to be made. And I see the necessity of those intervention, scholarly, in terms of activism, and even documenting extinctions. But how do you also negotiate these ones to also relocate, right? Relocate the languages of struggles from, that in itself is a huge work. And I don't think there is a simple conversation between the political at the state level and the community, whereby the community is resisting this disaster, having a readily available local knowledge. That community is captured through all of those crises. And how do we account for all of that as we also account for the sites of struggle? This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Voy a responder la pregunta de la compa puertorriqueña. I'm going to answer the question of the Puerto Rican comrade. There's no one way of going home. I don't know what's the route I'm building. I'm just building it at the time that I have this, so I live in California, in Los Angeles. I'm raised in Bogota, born in London. So I don't have a precise answer for you. I think you have to find your own answer for sure. But if you have that drive, follow it. Síguelo, follow it. I also believe that when we are driven and are feeling that pull, but for different circumstances, are studying somewhere else, working somewhere else, that doesn't take your right of participating in those processes that are local, as they make us believe. And actually that puts your feet in Puerto Rico and the other in wherever you're standing. And that gives you the right to speak about the problematics of where you're standing today too, right? So take the advantage of your personal perspective as a migrant to speak about the problematics of this particular place where you're living today and where you're rooting yourself in a way, and also take what you're learning here or the frameworks that you're learning in this particular place to be able to bring other perspectives to the conflict in Puerto Rico and the colonial conflict in Puerto Rico. So you do have that advantage right now, and so use it.
Thanks for those questions. Really interesting invitation to think between the panels. And I'd like to respond to Angelique's question about the general versus the specific, just to put it simply. For me, I mean, the problem with the Anthropocene and its discourse is it is generalizing and ideological. So the first line of attack has to be a critical comprehension of that term and resisting all the sorts of implications that it recruits us into by using the terminology in a rather ultimately depoliticized or conservative way. So I think there is value in speaking on a very general level about the politics of the Anthropocene. But I'm also following, I quoted this philosopher, Nancy Fraser, who's arguing for the trans-environmental. I think this is a real methodological significance to think these single-issue politics together. And I'm trying to put that into a comprehensive analysis, or at least comprehensive as it can be, to try to offer something that challenges a different kind of abstraction and generalization through the neoliberal Anthropocene. So I realize that ends up in potentially a very general way, but in a 20-minute presentation, it's hard to bring things down to earth and make it specific. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to offer a larger analytic for thinking about this stuff. Just to try to make it a little specific in relationship to some of the work that was presented. I think there are indeed lots of connections. If we think about the ibis, for instance, as this bird, one temptation would be to think about that species' extinction threat in a very narrow conservation or kind of biology of conservationism, and not to think about the sprawling, entangled conditions of what politics, climate change, drought, neoliberal structural adjustment, Gulf petropolitics, all the rest of it that comes together, war on militarism within the Syrian context. So I think the challenge is to connect the specific, in this case the ibis, to those larger stakes in developing this anti-systemic politics. I think that's really important, and all too often within political ecology and climate change thinking and activism, the tendency rather is to generalize in a really problematic way, according to this attempt to define climate emergency according to atmospheric carbon. So it's really, yeah, I plead guilty to generalizing, but I think it's important to develop these larger analyses so then we can subsequently make things more political. I think this happens in terms of the question of struggle and community. I agree with the point I think that you were making. I heard you say something, I think, that land struggles are yet to be made, that we can't assume the existence of a community in the first place. And this is indeed, I think, in my experience as well, part of the work, right? We're in places where we can develop this kind of comprehensive anti-capitalist, trans-environmental politics, but how does that put to work? How does that help mobilize people and form and grow a community of struggle in a specific place? For me, this is exactly the challenge, and this is what we're trying to do, for instance, in Santa Cruz, within those of us who are committed to this. And it's a big struggle because there's many communities in the area, and they're often completely at odds, completely, in a way, ideologically enemy formations. And this is part of the struggle. Like, how can we think about a climate future within California that doesn't simply accept the the recommendations of ultimately green capitalism, design, geoengineering, and the continuation of the growth economy. How can we begin by connecting these emergencies through, for instance, carcerality, the production of mass indebtedness, anti-homeless, xenophobia, anti-migrant sentiment, together with political ecology, environmental collapse, the spread of disastrous wildfires, drought, water politics, right? This is like connecting the dots. I think this is crucial to do, and we can't do that unless we have a large, comprehensive, anti-systemic argument. But it also has to be made specific through these struggles, and that's where we will build and form the communities dedicated to not only thinking about this, but trying to, dedicating ourselves to practicing, bring this alternate world into being.
Maybe we can. Okay, I think we've gone. Yeah. So that would be the last set of questions. Thank you everybody for attending this panel, and thank you very much. Fantastic.